Again, feel free to add yourself, feel free to alter the agenda. This is sort of trying to carry forward a collection of things. So if there are things that we're missing, particularly we always want to encourage people working on POCs or questions from implementers to fill themselves in here. As since we switched back from the flip-flop rotation, we're doing this more or less, we're giving some priority there. So I don't think, do we have anyone here who's been here twice or less who would like to introduce themselves? We always offer the opportunity, but we don't insist upon it. Okay, upcoming events. So we've got a CFP tracking spreadsheet. Question, do we have folks who are going to be at RSA? Do we want to do something like a meetup there?
I'm going to be at an SBOM meeting after RSA. It's during the RSA meeting, but it's not yet. Moscone, anyone wants to?
Yeah.
Join?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I know RSA is notorious for all the interesting meetings that are happening on the sides.
Yeah.
Cool. We have some desire to see if we can get something into DEF CON or to what are the appropriate villages there. I know we do have a talk coming up at Open Source Summit. Ava and I had a talk that got in there. Sadly, at OpenSSF Day, the talk that Frederick and I put in did not get accepted. They seem very focused on their own projects at OpenSSF Day. So anything else that folks feel we should add to the events spreadsheet? Okay. Community outreach. Do we have anything that folks feel we should update on community outreach?
So I've got a question about the community outreach stuff. We've been talking a lot about the producers of OmniBOR documents, but we haven't really talked much about the consumers. Oh,
interesting topic. Yes.
So I'm wondering, like, you know, we have correctly and been focusing on getting the things created. But should we start talking about the whole ecosystem and who might want to consume and how might they want to consume?
I think that's actually probably a good idea to start talking about. We've had a little bit of that in the form of our engagement with SPDX, which is in some sense a consumer, but that's a very small point case. It's almost the exception that proves the rule of the comment you just made, that we should probably reach out more broadly than just to them.
Cool. So maybe we have an agenda item for next meeting to give people an opportunity to think about it and bring their thoughts.
Yep. That seems like a great plan. Awesome. Anything else on the community outreach spreadsheet? Okay. All right, then, moving on. Do we have anything that folks want to show this week from POCs? We've had an exciting couple of weeks with POCs. We had demoing of OmniBOR integration in Patch, and we had demoing of OmniBOR integration in the assembler. Is there anything that folks would like to show this time?
I'm still working on the Python one.
Okay, but I did stick in the link to, I noticed you'd open a discussion topic on the Python POC. I did stick the link in on that. That sort of comes down to, I think, I've held open a space here under questions for implementers, because we had the Python POC piece in there last time for that. So if you've come across any new questions that you would like to sort of float up to the community on the Python POC, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I wrote a little bit of code. All it does right now is spit out shell launch for Python stuff. But
Everything starts somewhere.
yeah, I am planning on getting together with DPP to see if I'm barking up the right tree. So, make sure I understand the spec correctly.
Awesome, cool. And it might also be worth, I know that, so correct me if I'm wrong, so whereabouts in Python are you poking at? Are you poking in the Python runtime, the Python runtime itself, or are you poking at other places? The reason I ask is if, for example, you found yourself in need of some C functions for some of these things, we have example POCs you could pull from.
I wouldn't mind seeing an example. Yeah, I'm just writing it. I'm just writing it in Python at the moment.
Okay.
And because that's what I know.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, I have looked at the quote unquote compiler. It's actually quite interesting. There's some things I never knew. It doesn't generate a .py file unless you have an import statement, for example.
Unless you have a what?
An import statement. So if you write something that doesn't require an import statement, it doesn't generate a .py file.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That.
There's also something called a .pyd file, which I've never heard of before. And it's the equivalent of Python DLL, and it only happens on Windows.
Oh, interesting. That I did not know at all. I'm not a huge user of Windows, so.
Yeah, I don't think it changes much. And there's a .pyo file, .pyo file, which is if you turn off optimization or something, or turn it on, I think, or something like that. So
interesting.
All these things I never knew about.
It's one of the great adventures of something like this, actually.
Yeah.
Is the things you discover you never knew about. Cool. And then, correct me if I'm wrong, DVP, I think you were sort of poking around the edges of Java POC stuff. Am I misattributing that to you or misremembering?
No, that's correct. I am planning to do a JVM agent. I've gotten sidetracked with building an actual working Skit server. Skit is the IETF bomb storage mechanism. And so I actually want to put together a running server. So that's been consuming a fair amount of my time. And that actually leads into who consumes, because one of the parts of the upload of a software bill of materials is validation. And so I want to be able to plug in validation for OmniBOR documents, but I don't even know what they should look like, because right now we have directories. Should an OmniBOR document be a tarball of those directories? Should it be a zip file of those directories? What do we do here? So that's kind of why the interest in the consumption. Anyway, so I've been doing everything in the JVM for the server. And at some point, I'll just have a bunch of Docker build files and all that sort of stuff laying around that I'll repurpose to a JVM agent.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other things also that occurred to me, I had a conversation with someone on the Java side, and one of the things they were suggesting that might be a quick and easy way to get OmniBOR identifiers into an annotation in Java classes would be to look at Maven plugin. Because apparently that's, and it's been a while since I've mucked with writing Maven plugins, but they suggested that was probably quite a bit simpler.
So what I want to do is I want to create the OmniBOR documents from a Maven or Gradle or SVT plugin. That's the compilation phase. The runtime phase, and this gets back into our ongoing discussion about how do we deal with interpreted, and I'm putting this in quotes because most people don't think of Java as an interpreted language, but it compiles down to this intermediate representation. And, Robert, this is some of the stuff that we'll be dealing with in Python as well. If you load a PyC file, it's not a DLL, it's not native machine code, it's an intermediate representation. So I see the class loader JVM agent as the checksum or the check against the generated OmniBOR document. And I think we saw that on the Slack thread as well, when I can't remember the guy's name. Hang on, let me just go look at the thread for a minute. Arg threads. When Santiago was talking about why would you care about having the OmniBOR or the Gitoid emitted in a log file at class loading, and this kind of brings up the, are you loading a class for which you have a receipt or not? And if it's not, is that something that a security conscious organization should worry about? Has there been some side channel attack in terms of munching the bytecode between the time that it was signed and the time it is being delivered to the JVM? Anyway, I'm sorry for going off on a rant.
No, that's all quite good. I think you actually raised an interesting question of how do we aggregate input manifests, and part of that, quite frankly, and is in my mind is like, if we feed something to Skit, how are Skit's users finding things in Skit?
Yeah, well, right now Skit is write only. So you can upload SBOMs, but there's no, and you can receive a receipt for an uploaded SBOM, but there's no corresponding look this up or find this thing in the index. The only thing that you get is a guarantee that it will be appended to a cryptographically secure ledger, but nothing more. And so the consumption of the ledger entries is something that is, as of yet, ill-defined in Skit, or at least my reading of the Skit, current Skit standard. So yes, it becomes a very interesting thing of how do you index, if you have this ledger of uploaded various different software bill of materials, how do you index on it? How do you say which of these things has a transitive dependency to this other thing? Which of these things contains a Gitoid of ABC? That becomes a series of very interesting questions that allows us to create the kind of mesh that is, kind of how software is composed.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of, because to my mind that reads a bit on how you might choose to aggregate input manifests, because if Skit is basically an arbitrary, effectively, if Skit is unsearchable, right? If Skit is just something where I give you a pointer, and otherwise you have no idea where a thing is, first of all, it's going to rapidly fill up with a bunch of duplicate shit. And I'm sure that somebody has reasoned through some of these things in terms of value proposition, because we're dealing with fairly bright folks. But my first naive construction from that does not end up with something useful. So, okay. Also, are the Skit people looking at all at what's going on with SigStore and Recore?
I believe they are.
Okay. Just as long as that connection's been made for them, because my second thought was this sounds a lot like what Recore does.
So they're trying to do it. I haven't looked at Recore. I have looked at SigStore. SigStore is a standalone entity, but it is not a global shared federated entity. I don't know about Recore.
Yeah, it might be worth looking at.
Okay.
Cool. All right. So that's actually, so that I think is quite good. And that also gives us a consumption piece to talk about as a note for next time. Anything else on questions from implementers before we move on? So we had mentioned last time this. Yeah.
Are there example POCs or specs for POCs that I could look at?
For the
For anything, any language, yeah.
Yeah, so basically if you go look at let me go ahead and so if you go look at the GitHub for OmniBOR, we have a bunch of repositories, and in particular probably the most mature ones we have are going to be the LLVM OmniBOR, the GCC OmniBOR. Those are going to be probably the most mature things, and that they've actually built it all the way into the compiler.
Okay.
And then we also have binutils. Where did binutils get to? Binutils OmniBOR as well, which is built into some of the binutils tools like the linker, the GCC linker.
Thank you.
And so, you know, those are some places where we've actually walked through. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, thank you.
Cool. Thanks for making Skid a link.
Sure.
Cool. Anything else on questions from implementers before we move on? Okay, so we'd mentioned really briefly last time this article where CIS had been hacked on something where scanners simply failed to notice something that should have been flagged that it would have been flagged that they were using something OmniBOR shaped. And I guess the question is, do we want to do something like a blog post on this for the OmniBOR site? And if so, is there anyone interested in doing it? You don't have to necessarily answer today, but I wanted to sort of raise that as a thought for folks. Okay. Anything else before we move on to some of the active discussion bits, or more importantly, is there anything that folks would like to bubble up to higher priority or reorder? Because a lot of the stuff from here is listed out sort of semi-arbitrarily. So do folks want to jigger with the priority order?
Go back about the blog post thing. I think the first question we need to be sure of is that OmniBOR would actually help in that case. And I think this kind of goes back to the discussion of like the consumer side. Like, thank you, David, for raising it, because I think it's super important. And I think to a certain extent, without considering the consumers of this data, the generation side is being like all the discussion about generation is being done in a vacuum. So I think that will be an interesting discussion next time around.
Yep.
And as we know, vacuums suck. Sorry, couldn't resist.
All right.
You can ban me from the meetings from here on out, or just permanently mute me. Anyway, sorry.
Awesome. So under active discussions, the first set that we had up was the high-level explanation of what OmniBOR is. I think that actually had settled down to this new intro for the OmniBOR spec that I think folks were mostly happy with. And the only thing I think currently precluding its merge is we're waiting for Andrew to come back and sign it, because signature requirements got put on as a branch protection mechanism. And so I think that we're more or less ready to go with that. And so I think this discussion pending merging is probably mostly settled. Do folks have opinions or feelings on this?
I'm curious about the branch signature requirement. Like, what's that going to achieve?
Well, so it's not branch signature requirement. So basically, Ava turned on a bunch of branch protections, which included requiring signatures on commits.
What's that going to achieve? Like, how are we possibly going to tell whether or not a signature means anything?
So, I mean, on that front, that's a discussion that I think we probably want to wait for when Ava resurfaces. I know Ava's been on vacation and then traveling for business. I'm someone who's habitually signed all of my commits for the last decade, but I know that it's not necessarily something that is is as common for folks to do. I'm a little bit of a crypto nut, but I know not everybody is. But I think that's actually a valid question to raise, and I will go poke Ava about that again, because to a certain extent, it does produce a blocking problem in the system, because a lot of people will not by default sign their commits. And then there's a re-education problem. But signing, yeah. And depending on the sophistication around crypto, the person you're dealing with, generating your first set of keys can be annoying at best. And without those keys,
fundamental
as you said,
problem that, you know, unless we actually know who each other's certificate, you know, identities are, then it's just process for the sake of process.
Hello,
Yep.
hello.
No, I understand. Yes.
Just announcing my presence. This is Ava.
Oh, Ava, good. We just got around to this point of discussion. I missed you entering the room. So we were discussing the OmniBOR intro, which is still blocked on the commits not being signed. And so I think Jeremy had just raised the question of what are we achieving by requiring signatures on commits?
Oh, on the spec repo, I don't know that we're achieving very much other than sort of the normative baseline of, you know, proof of authorship. It is sort of a default for me across anything that I manage across open source to say, you should sign your commit. Is there a burden that some people are having difficulty signing their commits?
Well, we currently have the intro spec for the OmniBOR spec that has been hanging out for over a month because it's not signed.
Is it possible to have it signed?
I have poked Andrew about that. But I think Jeremy's question was more general than specific. Do you want to reiterate, Jeremy?
Yeah, I mean, unless someone has a sort of like well-established, you know, signature identity, then the signature doesn't actually mean very much. Like, I mean, from my point of view, like I've been an extremely long time user of PGP and then GPG and things like that, and tended to, you know, sign mail and sign commits and stuff. And I just gave up because I've never really seen it achieve anything. And like, except in very specific narrow circumstances. And it's not a thing that I've ever seen be useful by default. In particular, because all of this stuff is hinged on GitHub, we're basically relying on GitHub and people's authentication to GitHub as being that identity anyway. So it doesn't seem to add a lot of value.
I don't have a specific argument against, you know, GitHub identity being trustworthy. But it does sound like your position is sort of as a broad policy, don't bother signing things because it's not going to be, it's not a useful signal.
It's not a signal, I think, that outweighs the friction that it adds. Like, obviously for people whose sort of default setup and default mode of operation is to sign everything, then it's zero overhead. But it does mean that any contributor will have to do that. And like, maybe that's desirable. Like, having a bit of friction on contributors may kind of be a proof of seriousness. But
in the generic, I'm a minimized friction sort of person. But I also note that, as I sort of mentioned, that because I habitually do it, my perception of how much friction is not terribly well founded. But having walked people through on a number of occasions situations that did require them to create keys in order to deal with other situations in which the value was unequivocal, it can be a very substantial amount of friction. I've had very bright engineers that you literally had to talk them through the process. In spite of folks like us who've done it a lot, thinking of it being very well documented, it's just very counterintuitive to a lot of folks.
And it implies also that like everyone has a key management thing, because if I'm using this for multiple, actually I've never set up Git signing I haven't set up recently to use with GitHub, so I don't actually know what the process is. But my perception from having done this in the past is that you have to manage it, you have to do your own key management. And so like making sure you have consistent set of certificates across all the machines you might use or something like that is tricky. But maybe I'm wrong in this case.
And from the conversation I had with Andrew, that was actually kind of what had skewed things there. Was Andrew actually has some machines where he signs when he pushes. This one just wasn't set up that way, the way that he pushed from.
I think we're having two conversations in parallel, as we often do. One is, how do we unblock this patch? It sounds like Andrew could simply resubmit it from a different machine after assigning it. That should take maybe 60 seconds of effort on Andrew's part. I'm projecting how long it would take me to do that for my machine. I would go to a different machine, I would pull the patch from GitHub, I would sign it, I would push it back up, done. And the generic case of should we, in this project, require signing? Yes, it does add a little bit of friction. I agree that for some developers that may be a significant perceived burden. Do we want to not set the example of signing, but set the example of choosing to not sign?
Well, but I think there's three settings here, right? There's the requiring signing. There's whether people do or don't sign, and then there is just not signing at all. Now, we have people in the community who, as a matter of course, sign. I sign, you sign. Andrew, most of the time, from his description, signs. And I tend to think this is the kind of example that one sets personally. That adding friction, especially to adding friction, is I'm generally opposed to friction that doesn't outweigh the benefit of what that friction brings. And I think what you're arguing is that independent of the sort of concrete benefit that Jeremy's arguing against, there is a benefit in setting an example of signing. But I'm also not clear.
Also, there's also, if we allow signing and some of us sign some of the time, but not other times, and we end up with a mishmash, we are not in a position to say signing is ever useful, since we would ourselves be ignoring it, right? The signal that Andrew signed patch A but not patch B, that is a signal. And it could be as simple as Andrew forgot, or used a different machine, or something untoward happened. And I would prefer that there be two settings, because I do believe that the optional collapses into the not. It's either mandatory, and we have a gate on merging PRs that verify the signature, or we ignore them entirely.
Or we what? I'm sorry?
Or we ignore them entirely.
Yeah, given the nature of how Git constructs itself, my personal opinion is I think the friction outweighs the benefit in the case of Git signing of commits in terms of requiring them. And I say that as somebody who's signed my own commits for a decade. But in terms of requiring them, as I said, I've had other places where keys have been required and where people had to go generate keys. If your experience of generating keys for use matches mine, Ava, then my personal experience, which it's not that hard. I will tell you, I've repeatedly seen it trip very bright people up because it's just such a completely unfamiliar space. They don't understand where they're having to jump through the hoops. And there's a real tendency to just sort of walk away and say, this is just not worth it. I don't understand. It can be a really substantial tax.
Yeah, and I think also I don't see, even if everyone did sign, I don't see any value from that. I don't think the provenance of any particular commit is all that important if the content of the commit is okay. And I think as I said, with the GitHub infrastructure, if we start seeing commits from Andrew or anyone that appear to be invalid or forged or something like that, then that's kind of implies that the GitHub authentication has been broken, which also means that any certificates associated with that, like any signatures, are also not trustworthy because it suggests that there's a breach of security somewhere that is potentially quite serious. So
I don't actually agree with that statement because of the way GitHub interacts with Git branches. It would be entirely possible without signing for me to use my certificate or my login credentials with GitHub to write a patch that asserts it was authored by somebody else.
yeah, okay.
Write another patch authored by me, put the two into one branch and open the PR.
No, I okay. Yeah, I understand. I see that.
Right.
But
So
still,
the access token, yes, I agree, GitHub verified as the access token, but without having signing on the commits, there is no trail of record, as it were, that the author of the commit did in fact author that commit. I trust this community. I don't think any of us would do that, but it is to protect against that scenario that I support as a policy in open source projects that commits should be signed. And as a policy position, don't see why any one project should reduce that.
So DPP has his hand up.
Thank you for moderating it. I cannot see the screen. I'm on a cell phone walking around DC right now.
It's all good.
So two things. First of all, my understanding of some of the NIST standards and FedRAMP compliance and that sort of thing requires that all commits are signed. So just, if we're starting to think about going into the government, I think that kind of playing the way that the US government wants us to play kind of sends an important signal. The second thing is, one of the things that we're doing here is a defense in depth. In other words, if we think about what OmniBOR is about, it's about not catching perfection, but seeing whether there's change in behavior of running or compiled applications outside of the way that they were originally compiled. And one of the things that we're looking at is the fact that in interpreted languages, we're not going to have 100% fidelity between an OmniBOR receipt and the thing that's loaded into the runtime. I would argue that commit signing is exactly the same thing. In other words, it's a double check, as the scenario that Ava just put forth. It's a double check that we're kind of correct. It's not 100% guarantee, but if we start seeing things that are unsigned, or if we start seeing like things that look weird, we can double check the signal with the signatures. So I'm kind of in favor of requiring signatures for going forward for everything in this project. And it's the signal, and it is part of the overall defense in depth.
So to a certain extent, though, I'm go ahead, please.
Sorry, my screen keeps not letting me mute or unmute properly. Having a little trouble on the mobile. David, if you know which particular federal regulation that is, or which NIST guideline it is, I'd love it if you could share that to the group, because that is part of what I'm thinking of. I would love to see not just our spec repo, but all of the tools that people are building around OmniBOR be consumable in spaces that require, meeting that NIST guideline. I am hearing a rumor that other organizations may begin requiring compliance with that. We can go investigate those as part of what I'm doing this week. For example, hypothetically speaking, what if all FedRAMP required that? Don't know.
So I'm also seeing, so part of why I would love to see the reference on the NIST thing is it sounds like the sort of thing that NIST would ask for. But when I look at other large projects, like Kubernetes does not appear to be requiring commit signing. Just looking through their commit history. The things that are marked as verified are basically, you get some things where people have signed things, but you get other things where people have not. And so some of the larger projects out there who in fact have the greatest, tolerance for friction, and Kubernetes tolerates a huge amount of friction in getting stuff in, don't require signing.
Well, I think they personally think they should, and it'll be interesting if policies start to require that.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is I very rarely, I can't think of, and I'm sure you can, because I'm sure you got projects that do, but I can't think of a project off the top of my head that that does require, lots of things require signed off by, but I can't think of any that requires signed. And if NIST does in fact have a requirement for signed commits for code that's being consumed, that probably rules out the use of any open source software, because very few things are actually requiring signing. And since I'm pretty sure everything contains lots and lots of open source software, I mean, don't get me wrong, wouldn't be the first time the government required something that couldn't be done and then ignored the fact that the requirement wasn't being met.
Sorry, I didn't actually mean to derail the conversation quite that much. Like, if the general consensus is that signing is valuable and we should have it, then I'm fine. But I did want to just flag it.
Oh, we did get a comment, by the way, that in Ruby Gems, the push for signing went nowhere. So
yeah,
thank you for pointing that out, Josh.
Yeah, just using it as a real world example where like it's good to provide the option, but we saw like no actual usage of it. So
I mean, I agree with Ava
Yeah.
that optional signing is kind of useless, because it means that anyone who's trying to get around signing to do something untoward will just leave the signature off. And if that's
But we're not talking about random things coming in without code review, right? So you still have we still have code review going on and everything that's going in, and we're actually pretty thorough about the code review that we apply as a community, and that's really the point of gating.
In the sense of being very slow to land stuff.
I would ask, are we as thorough in the POC projects?
So that is going to be an interesting question for the POC folks. But I think probably, and typically speaking, most of the back and forth I've seen on the POC projects involves a fair bit of conversation among the people who are working on those projects. So a really normal thing is for someone to, like Andrew, to pop up and say, hey, I just pushed this PR for this thing. Could people go take a look at it, or that kind of stuff. And I think, generally speaking, we are seeing, decent eyes on things, but also usually requests for people to look at stuff from the author of the PR. So if I can make a suggestion so we can move on, because I know we've sort of put a lot of time into this. I would suggest that we default to the common behavior and then open the discussion of switching to signed behavior. We sort of very precipitously got a switch to signing without any discussion. And most communities don't require signing. And so how would folks feel about switching back to the sort of default behavior and then continuing the discussion about whether we want to move to a more stringent requirement? Don't all talk at once.
Well, so thanks, Jeff, for digging up the proper recommendation. You've just taken something off my to-do list. My bias would be to just start requiring it now. And I realize there's going to be some friction, or maybe what we do is we say, end of April, we start requiring it, so some pretty short fuse on it, and just go that way. I mean, once again, I'm not hearing, and Jeremy, correct me if I'm mishearing you. I'm not hearing oh my gosh, it's 1,000-pound boulder I have to roll up a hill. It's like, hey, this is a little bit more friction, and let's be frictionless.
So what I can tell you unequivocally from having dealt with other environments which required PGP keys is, even though there are people on this call, including myself, who are habitual users of this sort of technology, if you deal with engineers who are not, it is an enormous boulder for many of them. And so here's what I was really suggesting was, rather than completely burning this call into this discussion, can we get consensus to go back to the default behavior and then continue the discussion of what and when makes sense to introduce signing in the future? Because that unblocks the immediate set of problems. We didn't actually have any discussion around this before turning this requirement on to begin with. So I saw thumbs up from you, Dave. Do other folks have opinions?
I am the one who turned it on without checking with folks. I'm sorry that caused pain. I'm happy to revert until we can discuss it as a group. And my view as a position will be that we should turn it on.
I'm fine with what you just said as well, Ed.
Yeah, and by the way, Eva, that was not meant to be a criticism at all. Turning on things that one perceives as reasonable and uncontroversial, I have done that all the time. And occasionally I also step across into something that turns out to not be as I expected it. So not a criticism at all.
I did not take it as a criticism, and I apologize to those to whom I slowed down work unintentionally. I'm happy to unblock that work. It is an important patch to move forward with.
Cool. So we have 11 minutes left, which is a little bit tight. Is there something that folks feel we could productively introduce or discuss in the remaining time? Because we do have several things. I know we've got the tagging inputs for input role stuff that Jeremy, that you want to discuss. I know that we've got stuff on metadata for OmniBOR and the recording ephemeral output artifacts, which was something that was discussed last time when we looked at the assembler.
Can we spend 10 minutes just talking about a color of a bike shed?
Oh, Jeremy, that thought had also occurred to me.
But will the paint be signed? Will it be there a digital signature on the paint can?
Every work of art should be signed. The specific one is like, I don't really think we have time to delve into anything substantive. Like I would love to talk about the import role stuff because that's been hanging around for a while, but I don't think we're going to get anywhere in 10 minutes. The specific thing about artifact input manifest versus just input manifest might be a 10-minute scope conversation. It
might even be shorter than that because I think I was the primary proponent of artifact input manifests instead of input manifests. And when I attempted to put the terms in use in conversation, it became clear to me, at least, that I prefer input manifests. And so I don't know that we have any other remaining proponents of artifact input manifests.
All right, then. That was simple.
Color this in the, sometimes I'm wrong. So,
I like the symmetry of all of our terms beginning with artifacts. But that's my only argument in favor of it, and I can go anywhere.
Yeah, I can see that
I was
appeal, but my, if you think of the phrase output, artifact input manifest, and like, what do those words mean? It's not clear to me what the word artifact is doing in that phrase. Like, if you just treat it as some local color, then and ignore its meaning, then fine. But if you it seems to me that it just confuses matters as to what artifact you're actually referring to. If you actually try and take it seriously.
Yeah, I'm simpler than Jeremy, as I said. I actually share your instinct there, Ava, with the symmetry of it all. But when I actually was attempting to use it conversationally in the discussions, or in other discussions, I found input manifest seemed to flow more naturally, and that's why I'm weighing less on the symmetry personally. Do we feel like we have consensus towards input manifest at this time?
I abstain since my vote is supportive of both.
Okay. So we're down to 8 minutes. If we don't have anything that fits well in that time, my inclination would be to encourage folks towards going and participating in the discussions, and yield back the remaining 8 minutes to folks. Because there's a lot of good stuff happening in some of these discussions, and it's proved a very fruitful way to talk to ourselves as a community.
More precisely around metadata, if we kind of agree on what is the location, and we've kind of told that it needs to be extensible, so we can always add more stuff that we need as metadata, but more specifically in terms of what is the location and where do we want to record this metadata would be helpful, because there are some teams who are interested in trying to use OmniBOR for their code base to see and play with them. So I really feel that without metadata, it would be very hard for people to to process this data.
Yeah, that's fair. Now, one check though, we had previously talked about, and I'm basically putting metadata under OmniBOR DOR metadata.
Yes.
And possibly with some prefix. And yes, Jeremy, because you made excellent points about tool name being a terrible differentiator here. So but basically, we had a discussion about something of this form, and I think there's actually something in the spec of this form. Is what you're looking for different than this?
Is that agreed upon? I thought it was just discussed, but I wasn't sure if there is an entry in the specs to this effect.
Okay, so that's something we can go back and confirm for next time.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that's something we can go back and confirm for next time. That is a good point.
Yeah, my high level view is that, like, if the metadata is not hashed as part of any of the object identities, then it's not really in scope for OmniBOR. It's a thing that you can record, but it's not really a part of it. And if it is part of the hash, then that's kind of one of the things that the input tagging proposal is intended to address.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. Yeah, and that's I think on the input tagging though, we also effectively, when you're talking about from a metadata point of view, input tagging, if I recall correctly, because the OmniBOR input manifest is constructed with the build tool, would effectively have a pointer to metadata that the build tool felt was interesting. But it would not necessarily then imply other kinds of metadata that is constructed out of band of the build tool.
I mean, you could still add other metadata. You could like rewrite the manifest to add new metadata if you wanted to.
Yep. So that probably comes back to the bigger discussion around input tags.
Yeah, and
So-
also embedded versus not embedded is
Right.
like,
I mean, and I think at the root of that whole discussion, frankly, is which direction the tree points, whether the tree points down or whether the graph points down or the graph points up. You know, whether it points down from an artifact towards the things that are dependencies of that artifact, or whether it points up from the input manifests. Anyway, it's the longer discussion, and I'll add some of this to the discussion itself. Sound good?
yep.
All right, I'll see you all next week.